So you're taking Shelley's place then?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Is Shelley still doing public services?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yes, yeah. So she'll serve as a first alternate.
Okay, good, good. Well, thank you. Okay, agenda approval from last month's meeting. Agenda approval for this month's meeting. Are there any changes? Anything that anybody sees or needs to change? Okay. Could I have a motion to approve the agenda then, please?
Move approved.
And a second?
Second.
All right, so that's Anton with the motion and Brandy with the second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. All right, public comments for items that are not on the agenda. Is there anything that anybody has? Okay, thank you. Item 4, approval of last month's TAC meeting minutes. Are there any questions or revisions for the minutes? All right, I just had one for Teresa, I guess. If we can get back in the packet a roster of all the TAC members. I mean, this is a public document that goes out, and people we'd like to think would review this and want to come to the meeting. But it would be nice for them to know who the representation is for the TAC. All right, thanks. Okay, approval of the
Brian?
minutes. Yes.
Are you talking about for the meeting minutes or for the agenda as a whole? Because usually we have who showed up and who didn't in the meeting minutes, and
That's
that's
true.
also missing.
Yeah, that is
So
true.
do you want both of them?
However, it's consistent with the other committees and the board. I mean, if there's just one official roster, but then taking note of who
Okay,
attends
well,
all the
then we'll do
minutes. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good point. Okay, thanks. Okay, approval of last month's minutes. Could I have a motion for approval?
Did you want? Move approve.
Approval. Second. All right, so that's Anton and Brandy.
A question. Did you want the roster included with, as an amendment to the minutes?
Yeah, or just, yeah, going forward. Yeah, sure.
Is the motion maker?
I agree with that.
All right. Thank you. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, thank you. Item 5, Board of Directors report from last week's August board meeting. Ken?
There were no action items at the board. One of the, the board is still moving forward in developing its strategic plan, which does have a transportation element, and I think it'll be, I think October is the target date to have that approved. It'll be coming, when they get the draft final along enough, they will be sending it around to the committee, so there will be an opportunity to see it and comment on it. One of the discussion items was the CDOT performance measures that we talked about and last couple of months, and we have been discussing adopting the state targets as the PPACG targets. Several of the board members wanted much more information than I presented at the meeting, so we are setting up a workshop where they can get into the details of the data, how the targets were set, what the formulas are that are required by the feds, and some other information. And so we'll be setting up that workshop. If any of you are interested, let me know, and I can include you on the announcement or when we set that up. But right now, it's somebody from CDOT will be coming down from Denver and meeting with the board members to go over that topic. As another information item was the obligation of federal projects that John has had discussions with all of the entities here, and I think discussed that at the last board meeting. So that was presented. I don't remember any significant comments or direction. Okay,
I didn't remember any either.
okay. So that was it for the board.
All right, thanks, Ken. Any questions on that? Okay. So moving right along, our first action item, item 6A, PPACG's TIP flexible funding policy. Ken?
This is, the TAC is not being asked to take any action on this item, but it was presented as an action item, so if in the course of the discussion you decide you want to do something, then we can, by Roberts, go ahead and do it. You recommended some changes to the TIP flexible funding policy last month. When the item went to the CAC, they had a lengthy discussion and lots of questions about it, and tabled the item rather than making a recommendation to the board. And after discussion with the vice chair of the board and with Brian as chair of the TAC, it was decided not to submit tax recommendation all by itself, but to wait until we got a recommendation from the CAC, so that hopefully they would agree, but if they don't, at least there was the recommendation from both committees for the board to consider. To try to summarize what the CAC was interested in, they would like, several members asked for the chair, the city, and the county, or others from TAC to come and present to the CAC at their next meeting, which is the 29th of this month. What are the advantages of, well, let me back up a minute. They agreed and had no problem with the FHWA's request to clarify the language that money from a canceled project goes back to the regional pool, then to be reallocated by PPACG. It's not money from one project of it belonging to an entity to another project unilaterally. It's got to come back. And that's what you recommended, and TAC agreed. But on the other changes, let me pull that up. On the other changes to the flexible funding policy, where it's in your packet. It was the last paragraph where we said those funds, currently it says those funds will be allocated to projects based on the original score. And you recommended changing that to saying those funds may be allocated to projects based on their original score, and recommended deleting the sentence, the next to the last sentence that says if a project is canceled, it cannot go onto the waiting list. You recommended deleting that. They had some concerns, misunderstanding, other issues about those particular items. And I will just try to summarize their comments. Please have a TAC member present, present their rationale. Individual wants a healthy, accountable way of handling the funds. It would be an unfair allocation method if one entity gets it all and the others don't have an opportunity. If we're going to change will to may, then define the process that will be used to allocate the funds. So right now, we say we identify the process, and it's very direct, and then we say they may be used. Well, if they're not used, then what is the process? So they're looking for the process to be identified in the policy statement. They would like somebody from TAC to explain what are the advantages. We went from a straightforward statement, and this was an individual that was involved in the tip policy discussions last year when we changed the note policy. We went from a straightforward statement to a wide open statement. There must be some middle ground language that gives flexibility without throwing out the note policy even more than it has been. So he gave an example. Under normal circumstances, we do this, but with identified exceptions, then he wants those listed, we would do something else. One individual would like a couple of case studies presented. That is, if this happens, we do something. If something else happens, we do something else. So that was kind of the summary. Both John and I addressed them and tried to answer their questions.
So that's all they're asking for? Just that?
Yeah.
So, refresh my memory. Why did we recommend changing will to may? What was the rationale behind that? Remember? Okay.
I would say flexibility, because if you give it to whoever's the highest score, then if they're not ready to build, then it just sits there, and then it's allocated to that project.
Mhm.
But if we decide that we want it allocated to a different project, we have the flexibility to move it to a different project.
With a good rationale.
Correct.
Why it shouldn't go to
Correct.
the top rank, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, this is pretty clearly defined. I mean, we're addressing federal highways concerns about money staying with an entity or with a project, or that the money doesn't just stay with the entity, it's tagged to a project. And if that project gets canceled or rescoped to where it's not a functional project anymore and that those funds are returned, it goes into a pool, and we all have access to it. There's no gaming the system to make sure that one entity gets it or one project. So I would be I'll most likely go, just because I normally go, although I wasn't at that one, thank goodness. But if there are volunteers to go with me at this month's CAC meeting, I'd appreciate it, especially. Okay, all right. We can volunteer Victoria since she's not here, right?
I can volunteer Victoria anyway.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
When's the next CAC?
It's
29th?
3 o'clock on the 29th. It's the last Wednesday.
All right. And so once we get a group of us together, not that we want to call a special meeting, but we should just, coordinate our responses to make sure we're addressing everything that they're asking, so we're not caught flat-footed.
Do you see any reason not to vote on this today, since we basically agreed on it last time?
I
That
say
way
our
we would-
recommendation still stands.
Yeah, we can at least check that box.
You don't need,
Did we vote?
it's an action item, but I guess, you can just say, you don't make a motion, we don't do anything with it.
Right.
Okay, so I can't remember. We voted on this, and this was our official.
Right.
Okay, so we've already checked that box.
That's, you don't have to do anything, and what was attached, what's up on there, that's what will go to the board, when this finally goes to the board.
Okay.
Victoria did, at the last TAC meeting, she said the change would allow, instead of the way it's worded, that projects are ranked by score. She says the change would allow, change it to may because a project may not be ready to go. So maybe your top-ranked project is not ready to go, but it's not identified in here. But if you go back to our discussions last year, when this kind of process, we learned from North Front Range or Dr. Cog, somebody has offered the money. If they don't want it, it's not enough, or they're not ready to go, then you move down the list to the next one. So that possibility is already there. It's not an automatic score only. And we don't use the score only in selecting projects for the plan or for the tip. There is always that professional judgment that gets factored in, and that was explained to the CAC. Maybe they didn't understand it or
Yeah.
it's smidged over, but.
Yeah.
So I think with, somebody coming there and addressing their concern that if we're not doing this, because it says we will do it one way, now we say it may be done. So if it's not done, then what other way is what is it? And they're looking for that language in the policy. I don't know if you want to try to address that, and modify your recommendation today, or stand on it and move forward. There is no official deadline for this change. FHWA would like it sooner rather than later. So that's why they wanted to push forward and have their change made rather than waiting a few more months, because John's already announced that we're going to review all of the policies. And whatever we leave in or take out or new put in may get revised in a few months when we look at the whole thing all over again. So FHWA wants theirs to move forward, regardless of what happens with our other changes.
Right. Brandy?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the last bullet address that? The project sponsors may request to cancel one of the own funded projects as the remaining funds return to the regional pool. Any entity needing funds for cost overruns may then request the use of those funds. Did that not address their concern?
That bullet, the changes in the bullet satisfy FHWA.
But that didn't
That
satisfy the CAC?
That satisfies CAC for the FHA's request. All of their concerns were centered on the change in the last paragraph.
Right, but basically that bullet says that any entity needing the funds for cost overruns may request the use of those funds, which actually contradicts the fact that it says those funds will be allocated to projects based on their original score.
There's some,
Just checking.
the whole document is not
Right.
real clear.
Right, but I think our change actually clarifies it because it's then consistent with the last bullet. If you want to take that to the CAC.
And the only comment that I have is just the fact that that may statement allows us to be able to use a score if we have two entities going after the same money. It gives us the ability to be able to make that tiebreaker, give the tiebreaker a decision.
Right.
That's what I thought we were
Yeah.
doing with it.
Yeah, yet it also gives us the flexibility, like what Ken said, if an entity is not ready for that project, they can pass, but if it
Right.
says will, we'd have no flexibility.
Right.
We'd have to give it to
Exactly.
that, so, yeah, all right,
It's like a must and a shall.
yep, yep, all right. Everyone still good with leaving this as is? Okay, all right, okay, good. So who said, you'll talk to Victoria, Anton, and Brandy, did you say you'd be?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Between the two of us, I'm sure,
yeah.
we'll do that.
feeling well, we'll do that.
So, Ken, let me back up, I'm sorry. Do they want us to remove the line, if a project is canceled, it cannot go on the waiting list? They wanted us to remove that also?
No, they didn't say what they want to remove or what they want to keep.
We did that.
They,
We did that.
Yeah, there is no actual waiting list. That's why we did that.
yeah, and Don, what you see in...
I got it, now I'm with it, I'm
that-
sorry, thank you.
yeah,
I
everything
wasn't
in-
here last month, so I'm just playing a little.
Yeah,
catch up.
everything up in red is what the TAC recommended.
Okay, thank you.
So CAC did not make any recommendations. They did agree that the changes to the bullet, the fourth bullet up there, which only addresses FHWA's request, they agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Okay, good. Thanks, everybody. So we have a couple weeks to get ready for that and look forward to that. Item 6B, request to submit a long-range transportation plan application past the deadline. Jennifer?
Okay, good afternoon, Jennifer Valentine. I'm a transportation planner with PPACG. So I'll give Karen just a second to finish passing out a handout. So kind of a last-minute addition to the agenda. We received an email a few days ago from Kyle Fenner from the Manitou Metropolitan District asking if there was any way that we could consider including the project that's described in your handout in the long-range plan scoring process. They did obviously miss the call for projects window, and so we felt the most appropriate thing would be to bring this issue to the TAC, since this is largely the group of project sponsors. You know as much about the project as I do at this point. I know it's a parking garage in Manitou Springs, but the conversation I've had with Ken earlier today and with John, and he sends his regrets that he can't be here today for this, was it's really more in principle, whether you like or support this project or not. The question at hand really is, are you willing to entertain a late application, because it kind of sets a precedent. Then someone else could potentially come forward and say, oh, we have an application too, and then we would have to decide, do we bring it back or do we say no? So really we just want to have the conversation about, are we entertaining late applications, or are we saying the deadline was the deadline? Karen, if you want to talk about the project at all, you're certainly welcome to.
I don't have a lot to add at this point.
Okay. Yeah, and there was even a little bit of uncertainty about whether this project even needs to be on in the long-range plan. It seemed like there might be a federal funding component. John had a conversation with Kyle and made it clear that if there's no federal funding component, you don't necessarily need to be in the long-range plan, but she was pretty insistent that she thought this project should be in the long-range plan, which is why we're here today.
So I have a few comments, so I'll just start, and then we can go around the table if we need to. So is this a request, not only to accept a project past the deadline, but are they seeking federal funds for this? Because, I'm not really even sure that this is an eligible cost. A parking structure, I don't really believe is an STP Metro fundable project.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm playing a little bit of telephone here because all the correspondence has been between John and Kyle. I'm not sure why he came away unsure whether they were seeking federal funding. Like I said, he made it clear to her that if they weren't seeking federal funding, if it was just a private project, we didn't necessarily need to score it. Kind of like the Powers Extension project, for example. We'll want it on the list, but we're not going to score it. It's not competing for the same pot of funding. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
No,
but I guess the bigger picture question is just, so we don't have an application yet. We have sent her the application form, but the question is, are we willing to accept it or not?
Okay, yeah. Well, my feelings are, we have 9 member governments here that make up the TAC, and we knew months in advance when the project application deadline was. This is similar, if you're applying for grants, any other federal agency or the state, historical societies, they all have project deadlines, and application deadlines are usually pretty strict. You don't get it in by close of business or whatever time, and on that day, you're out of luck. There's no gimmies or please let my project be part of this. And yeah, I agree with you, Jennifer. This sets a dangerous precedent. And we even asked last month, or I guess it was last month, if we could have,
An hour. I asked for an hour,
yeah, 8 a.m. and go
And
to
we
9.
said no.
and the response was no.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
to make sure that we got it in on time, I busted my butt, or me and the staff busted our butts to get it in the Friday before. So I do have some issues with this, knowing what we went through to meet the deadline. And then if we set precedents and here we allow this addition after what we had to do, based on the direction from staff, I kind of do have issues with this request.
So one other thing to note, we did grant everyone the 1-month extension on projects that were not seeking federal funds or that were already in the TIP. So this project could potentially fall under that category and be fine to be, included in the list. At this point, we don't know, but again, the bigger picture issue.
Right. Yeah, and, we work very closely with staff, and what we've been hearing is this long-range transportation plan timeline is on a pretty tight schedule. And so, that's where we are. We can't really afford to put the brakes on, and, I think the deadline is the deadline. But, yeah,
So,
Anton?
Brian, if I may, and I'm not, absolutely, I'm not advocating for this, but if this were to be considered, then I would think we would also have to, in order to maintain parity amongst all of the other member governments, to extend the timeline to this date, or the 2.5 weeks past it was requested, for us to all go back and relook at all the projects that we submitted. I'm not advocating for that. I think that puts us into a further behind the schedule that we have heard about for months, several months. I would struggle very much to support a late submission, if for nothing else, no other reason than just the parity and keeping it equal amongst all the governments who did participate and did follow the rules.
I know that Victoria was begging or imploring also for a midday to end of the day extension. Yeah, and that so that was also frowned upon. So I just in fairness to the rest of us, I do have some concerns with this request. It seems like it's if there was a park and ride element to it, then it might be a good TIP or long range plan project. I don't know. But
Yeah, and there just seems to be a lot of unknowns about this, whether they're seeking federal funding, and, if they're not, and, it's one of those regionally significant projects that has to be in the plan because of that, then it can just be added in, right? I mean, it's not going to be
as a
scored.
local funded.
It's not competing with the rest of us. It's not competing against Manitou's Hiawatha Gardens Transit Center project, right?
Right.
So I think we just need to know a little bit more about that. But as far as extending the deadline for an application for federal funding, I think, unless anybody has anything else to say, I'd say it's unfavorable.
Okay, I think we would like
Okay.
a motion or.
All right. Would anybody like to make that motion?
Sure. I make a motion to deny the request to extend the timeline for accepting projects for the long-range transportation plan.
Thank you, Anton. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion. I'll second the motion with a question. So when this goes to the board or the CAC or the next steps, will it?
I don't think so, just because of the nature of the request, and it was really pretty specific to this group. I think staff could have just made the decision, but we thought it was more fair and made more sense to bring it before this group. So I don't think it's going to CAC or the board.
Okay. I would like, if it does get to a point where there's further discussion upstream, that what the others had to deal with in order to meet the deadline be conveyed.
Sure.
And we appreciate you bringing it to us. It kind of insulates PPACG a little bit too, but I think there's good things that happen when there's a little bit more collaboration and coordination, so we appreciate that.
Yeah, I think it was a good opportunity just to sort of cement it, that we were pretty firm all along about the deadline as the deadline, but now let's be really sure. So
Right.
now we're sure.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, item 7A, long-range transportation plan funding categories. Jennifer.
Okay, so we just wanted to, I think we're good, Teresa. So we just wanted to bring this today as a discussion item, just to do that, to start a discussion about, and this would really apply to the next plan cycle. You know, you've already submitted the projects. The table in your memo is the table you saw in the application instructions, and that was your guide for sort of the maximum amount of funding in each of those categories. So a little bit of history. We've used these sort of breakdowns of funding for the past few plan cycles. It's not something we're tied to. It's not a federal requirement to set aside 15% of, STBG funds for bridges, for example. It's just something that the region has chosen to do over the past few plan cycles. We have had discussions about, currently in our long-range plan, there are breaking down into more specific funding categories is a little bit more limiting for the region than it needs to be. So if there's a change in project funding, then we have to come through and make an amendment to the long-range plan. Whereas if things were described in a more general way, we would have more flexibility if there were sort of changes in those funding categories. So all along, it sounded like all of you, or some of you at least, were in support of that more general breakdown, but we did want to start the discussion now and then just kind of get it in place long before we start the next plan cycle, and just have that direction.
Tim.
So I guess a lot of you were not part of the TAC when this funding categories were set up. And it was actually, I think, initiated or strongly supported by the county, because a lot of the when you get into all the project submittals, bridges tended to score lower than transportation projects, especially when you get into congestion and the way the criteria were always set. So in order to kind of broaden our abilities to construct other projects than just like the heavily congested roadway widening type projects, there was a recognition to break it into these categories. At the same time, like studies and things like that, and Wendy, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe studies were also not scoring well. So there was an attempt, I think actually PPACG staff suggested something along this category because we weren't getting a good range of addressing more than just roadway needs that are eligible for the funds.
There wasn't a variety of projects.
Yeah.
And it was kind of an idea to score all lake projects the same, like all bridge projects will be scored the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Planning studies and
Consistency.
so on, congestion management. So everything was kind of in their own category, and the funding was broken up that way. And yeah, I mean, it seemed like a good idea, and it's worked, but I kind of also see some benefits of having it wide open, because I mean, didn't we just get into an issue where with the last TIP, the projects that were identified in the plan as CMAQ or whatever, we couldn't, since CMAQ's going away, we couldn't use TAP money, so we got into that issue, right, where we couldn't cross.
Right. We've locked ourselves,
Yeah.
nailed one foot to the floor unnecessarily is what we've done by putting projects into the plan by category.
Yeah.
And by funding category. And John wants to move away from that. He thinks that's unnecessary, and actually we lose flexibility. I think we've gone through 2 plans now with this funding categories. One time, we actually developed scoring criteria that were specific for bridges and plans and congestion, and other times we just had one one set of criteria that applied to everything, and then you just compared the bridges with their score from a universal criteria in the bridge category. And you scored plans against each other for the planning category. So we've done it both ways. Now, there was no justification given for the selection of the percentage when we first adopted this. It was an idea that was thrown out, and everybody loved it immediately and said yes. But there was no justification as to why bridges are 15% and not 20%. So we've got, if somebody asked a question, we've got no, it's another way of establishing a priority for the region, and we've got no justification for the priority that this sets.
Right. So, does this mean that, so the top 4 rows here are all STP Metro. So it's bridge, congestion management, plans and studies, and then general. So are you talking about leaving it wide open just for STP Metro or for TAP too? I mean, TAP, just this much money for everything, and it gets broken up depending on how projects scored?
I think the idea was not to be so specific with STP Metro.
Okay. TAP still has to stay.
I think so,
Somewhat
yeah, and to
separated.
kind of,
And I'm thinking the other way, so that's something we need to resolve.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to kind of add to Ken's point, so there's a couple of things here. Do we want to continue to break things down? And if we do, are these the right percentages? Because this is, like Ken said, almost another set of prioritization or weighting. And we did develop with the CAC the weighting system for scoring. So the region has already said that I think it was safety and congestion maybe were the 2 most important things. And so, if we got rid of this, we would have to be more careful next time around if bridges, if we have a lot of bridges falling into the creek and that's a real priority, we got to be careful how we set up our scoring criteria, that they're not just getting 9 points and then zeros everywhere else, and so none of our bridges get fixed. And then the committees and the board are going to have to come back and fix that.
So could I ask, in lots of years of doing budgeting over long times, I've seen funding wedges that you put in for different critical or items or emphasis items. And I appreciate that we've done it both ways in the past. Is there a way we could provide a way to illustrate the history of what has happened in each way we've tried it? We say, you said a few years prior when it was wide open, and everything competed in the open. Could we see some of this? Is there any way to pull statistics or get any information about how many bridge projects or studies projects occurred during the time that it was wide open compared to how many were submitted versus what we were looking at for the last time when it was broken out into these special interest areas? I'd just like to be able to compare apples to apples as to what was before and what was after. I'm not advocating either way. I don't want to set up a certain, we want bridges right now. I'll pick on myself. So we, the county, want a wedge for bridges right now because we know we're going to submit a lot of bridge projects. I think that's unfair and not equitable. Conversely, if bridges have not done well, as you were mentioning, it has to be repaired or we have to fix our model at the board. I'd like to go in there with eyes wide open. So could we get some information on comparison of before and after the special interest wedges were introduced?
Maybe.
Then I would recommend we table it until we can figure this out. I mean, history matters. So I think getting some feedback on how the history got here would be good to help illuminate why we made this decision, and if it's not appropriate anymore, we can make a recommendation to change it.
Yeah, I say maybe because your comment about how many bridges were submitted every time we had the process as compared to how many were selected. I can tell you how many were selected. because we've got the 2035 list, and we got the 2035 update, and the 2040 list. I'll have to look through the records and see, do we have a stack of applications from each of those time periods as to what was submitted as compared to what was selected? Otherwise, yeah, it's, like, I can tell you, yeah, there were no bridges selected for the 2035 plan. Now,
Yeah,
is
but
that
if none were
because,
submitted, then it's-
and none were submitted, or we had a bad process? Which was it?
Right, and that's what we're trying to figure out. I understand what you're saying.
So we can try looking into it, and we're going to hire 2 new people. Maybe they'll be here in time to help with that. But this is something that we're going to have to decide in the next couple of months. I think it's October, maybe November, that CDOT commission is going to finally approve resource allocation for the 20 years. December. So, all right, maybe we got it more than a couple months.
So as an alternative to that, I mean, would it be practical to, once all the projects are evaluated and scored, to like create 2 scenarios, one using this same broken out method, and then one using the more flexible method?
Yeah.
And then see which one we like better. Just as an alternative. I mean, from what you said, it sounds like an awful lot of work for staff. But the way you explained it, you could just look at the constrained list for each plan and find out how many bridge projects, how many congestion management projects there were, and figure that out easily. But
So when we submitted our projects, we submitted them according to the percentage that were laid out. And that's how we fitted, that's how we maneuvered, postured some of our projects.
you couldn't submit for more than
We couldn't
what
submit
was
them
in
more
the-
than what you had over here, over there. And so there were some projects that you were excited to get in there, and there were some projects that were like, it was tough to make the decision to not include them. So before we go changing, because that would change our submissions, or hang on, it potentially could impact the submissions that we've made already.
But we're not talking about doing this now. This is for the future. So this is the next
Okay.
time. So
Okay.
it
Well,
won't
thank you.
impact anything
Okay.
right now. This is just a conversation for the next time.
Okay, thank you very much. That's
Yeah, we're way ahead of the game
right
at this
on.
point in time.
Okay. Then I still would want to see what would be the impact. And maybe using it for this time would be a good example of what did happen. So I would agree with that then.
Well, I do have a concern with that because we do have the breakdown that forces us to, doesn't force us, but it's to our advantage to submit bridge projects that we need. But if we're into where we're not broken down into these percentages, then we're submitting projects based on the scoring criteria and putting our best projects forward. And we might have good bridge projects, but if we know they're not going to score well, we're not going to submit it, right? And that's kind of, I think it would be skewed to say that if you kind of just open it wide up, that would be an indicator of what it would be like without the breakdown. I being like one of the longer tenured TAC members, I remember.
Did you
Yeah,
say
okay.
old?
Being old, ancient. I remember when we wouldn't submit bridge projects because they wouldn't score well. Even though we had the need, we would not do it. Our focus was, I think, congestion was part of it, so we would submit congestion projects, even though the need was there, and we were having, flooding and bridges in really bad shape. But we knew that they wouldn't score well, so we wouldn't submit them. And that's just the way it is because, we have the criteria and we're trying to submit our best projects based on that criteria.
So it seems like kind of an obvious comment, but no one has said it yet. So I wonder if we could continue using some form of these percentages in the application process and developing the fiscally constrained list, but then collapsing them when we actually develop the long-range plan document. So we got to this list this way, but they all get lumped back into STP.
general, yeah.
Well, STP general is one of these 5, so I guess it's even more general than that.
Yeah.
Can
And
I-
we're not limiting ourselves with the flexibility,
percentage
but we're
in the-
still
yeah.
ensuring that our real needs are being met.
Can I follow up with what Anton was saying? Is there a way to see how much money has been spent in each one of those categories, and if those percentages are actually equating to projects that are funded? Is there a way to see that the funds have actually been allocated and the projects have been built and the funds have been expensed?
All of the money was 100% spent in those categories, except for planning. And I remember, I don't know if it was the first time or the second time, there weren't enough planning projects submitted to use up the money. So those that were submitted, we didn't bother scoring. We just automatically said they're going to be funded. And whatever was the balance in the planning category was put back up in the general SDP category.
So if all the monies in bridge were spent and all the monies in congestion were spent, just playing devil's advocate, why would we want to get rid of that? I could see it if we're not spending all the money, it gives us flexibility, but if we're spending all the money in each of those categories, why are we having the conversation?
Is this still a priority that the region wants?
Okay, so I guess
Are
that's the
bridges
bigger
a
question. Are bridges and congestion
Are
management
bridges a
still a
15?
priority?
Yeah, are bridges a 15% priority, or should they be a 25%
Right.
priority?
Right,
Based on what?
right. And I'd say based upon what Tim's saying, what Anton's saying, in order for them to score, I think you need the categories there. Whether the percentages change or not are up for conversation, but without those categories being there, if they don't even score, then you're not going to submit them. And if you don't submit them, then they don't get repaired.
Right. I kind of like what Jennifer's saying, though, is, kind of setting up the projects for inclusion in the 2045 plan, or the long-range plan in general, using these criteria, but allowing more flexibility in the long-range plan when we're pursuing funding in the TIP, right? That's the purpose of providing more flexible funding? Is that the benefit of that, or what would be the...
I think some of it was tied to just if there are changes down the line in the funding stream, we're having to make an amendment to the long-range plan, I guess,
Gotcha.
to keep that consistency between the TIP, which is the newer information, and the long-range plan.
So as additional monies come, you have to divide it up and figure out which category it goes into. Is that
I think so.
part of it?
Yeah. So are there, this is a discussion item today. Are there specific items we could bring back to further the discussion? We've heard a couple of things thrown out. We're going to check into the maybe. And is there anything else we can bring to help make the decision?
Well, the question is, I would like to know if your option of expanding it and then collapsing it is an actual option.
Okay.
So that would be helpful to know.
And it'll help next month to have John here because this is kind of his bread and butter, so he can contribute.
And Anton, if you can share this with Victoria, I'm sure she could provide some insight next month too. But I think just keeping it on the agenda again for next month
Okay.
to rediscuss would be good.
Well, she and I discussed this at length when we were putting together our plan about why certain percentages, why there were wedges for certain things, and we both violently agreed that there are pros and cons to doing this. What we didn't know, looking at this, is considering that we now have a new scoring algorithm. What is the impact of the scoring algorithm here? Because there is some there's points that can be made for bridge projects and the like. So I do like the idea of certainly not scoring the projects twice, but just seeing how they would fit under the algorithm of the 15 to 10% and that, and then looking at this just wide open, and then having a conversation about it then, because right now, I agree with you, Ken, is 15% right? Should it be 5%? Should it be 20%? I just don't know, and it'd be good to have some projects up there to kind of understand what the impact is of doing that. So if we don't have the old data, maybe looking at the data we have, or the submissions we have now, would help illustrate it to us, and maybe we can make a better decision at that point.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at is, because if you, I mean, all the projects are going to be scored, they'll only have to be scored one time, but if they're done using these two scenarios, yeah, I mean, maybe roadway projects, we find that the trend is that they're scoring higher than bridge projects. So under the general scenario, more roadway projects would be, would have, score better than bridge projects, and maybe less bridge projects could be funded. So it would be nice to see how both of those work out.
I think the thing we, as PPACG, don't know really that the project sponsors would know is, would you have submitted additional bridge projects if that was 20% or 30%? And we never received the application, so all of those funds were spent, so maybe 15% isn't too high, but we have no way of knowing if there's kind of a latent demand for additional bridge projects. And you guys can anecdotally tell us that, did you have to make trade-offs about what to submit, or was there enough to go around? There's
And
always
we
enough.
did.
So
Yep.
Yeah.
we made changes, and we dropped some areas of the paint, and decreased the notional scope of some, and decreased the notional scope of some projects just because we start running out of money.
I mean, if there was kind of an obvious, we had 10 bridge projects we really wanted to submit, and we had to cut 5 of them, kind of thing, or if it was just trade-offs all around because there's never enough money to go around, right?
So again, refresh my memory, wasn't too long ago where we also had a percentage of each funding category was designated for smaller member governments? What was that during? Was that during the last TIP process?
TIP policy.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And we floated that idea around, but at this time, that just remains a TIP-specific policy.
Yeah, okay, all right. All right. Anything else for this item for today? All right.
All right, well, we'll see what else we can bring
Yeah.
next month and keep talking about it.
Okay,
so.
thanks, Jennifer. Okay. Item 8, member entity announcements. Is there anything anybody would like to share? Jennifer?
Well, Ken mentioned this, but I'll just be a little bit more specific. So we do have another planner starting on September 4th, I think, so just after the holiday weekend. And then we're going to have a full-time TIP person starting on October 1st.
Great.
So we're excited.
Congratulations, yeah. All right, anything else from anybody? Okay. Items for future TAC meetings. Well, we know that the funding categories will be on there.
I better put down performance measures.
So we'll be bringing project scores that may or may not happen in September.
Okay.
We need to bring cost overruns, a request for cost overruns. We haven't done that, so we can do that next month.
Okay. So every quarter we're doing this?
Mhm.
So September's, okay.
Do we have any money?
Was that?
We should actually have a project where we're returning funds next month.
Okay. All right. And thank you for processing that administrative change for us and for the county, I believe, too. So that was great to have done. Thank you.
Hopefully, everybody got Anton. I copied Victoria on an email about her roll forward for your safety planning project. We've been having and are still having email problems when we send stuff out. People are not receiving it, and it's hit or miss as to who gets it and who doesn't. So,
Okay, well, as you send things to Victoria, if you'll please just copy me on that, include that, and we'll
Okay.
make sure, if maybe one of us will get it, and if neither of us do, then
it went out
Do
Monday
that.
or Tuesday.
yeah. Victoria's really good about forwarding things on to me, but
Okay.
I
Not
can't
if she
tell you
doesn't
that
get
I've
them.
seen this one. You want that?
Not if she doesn't get them.
Sure, not if she doesn't get it. If you'll send it to me, we can do a follow-up. She's out today.
So I have a couple emails to PPACG staff where it says delivery notice delayed or things like that too. So where I sent an email that apparently didn't go through.
So I sit next to I know nothing about IT, but I sit next to our IT person, and I think what happened was, so we just came into the 21st century, we upgraded from copper to fiber, so now we went from like 3 megabyte internet to, I don't know, something in the hundreds. But as part of that process, they had to update our firewall and our sonic wall and something with the IP address. Somebody inverted 2 numbers, and so we were getting all these bounce backs. That was a couple of hours ago, and it was supposed to take effect in a couple of hours, so hopefully, at this point, we're good, but growing pains of coming into this 20%. But if it said it was delayed, that's the same thing that happened to me, and eventually it will tell you it wasn't delivered, but it might be like Sunday before it tells you that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Nothing from anybody else? Okay, let's adjourn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if